Miriam Osei Bonsu learned early that buildings do not lie. People lie. Numbers can be arranged to suggest things that are not true. Photographs can be taken from angles that hide the cracks. But a building, a bridge, a foundation, a wall carrying 3 floors of weight above it, a building tells you exactly what it is. You only have to know how to read it. She learned this from her father, Emmanuel, who was not an engineer, but a carpenter in Accra, who built furniture that lasted decades longer than anyone expected. He would press his palm flat against a plank of wood before he cut it, close his eyes for a moment, and then tell her what was inside it. The grain, the knots, where the stress would concentrate if you pushed it wrong. Every material has a truth, he told her once, when she was 8 years old and sitting on an overturned bucket watching him work. Your job is not to argue with it. Your job is to understand it and work with it. She did not become a carpenter. She became the kind of person who looked at a bridge the way her father looked at a plank of wood, pressing her understanding against its surface until she felt what was inside. She was good at this. She was, if honesty is allowed here, exceptional at it. Not in the way that gets you featured in magazines or invited to give talks, because that kind of exceptional requires a particular talent for self-promotion that Miriam had never developed. She was exceptional, in the quieter way, the way that means the work is simply right, consistently, year after year, in ways that compound slowly, until the person doing the work becomes load-bearing in ways that are invisible, until something shifts. She moved to the United States at 26, with a master's degree from the University of Edinburgh and a single large suitcase that was heavy with textbooks and light on everything else. She had a cousin in Philadelphia who let her sleep on a pull-out sofa for 3 months while she sat for her professional engineering certifications and sent applications to firms she had researched with the methodical care she applied to everything. The pull-out sofa had a bar in the middle that pressed against her spine. She slept on her side to avoid it. She did not complain about this because she had not come to Philadelphia to complain about sofas. Dunmore Infrastructure Group offered her a position in February of that first year, a junior structural role. The salary was fair. The work was interesting. The office was in a building she evaluated quietly from the sidewalk before her interview. A 1970s construction, well-maintained, load-bearing columns, visible through the lobby glass. She took the job. She was 27 when she started. She was 41 when she left. In between those two facts is 14 years, which is a long time by any measure, and an especially long time to spend building something in someone else's name. In those 14 years, Miriam did the following things, among others. She redesigned the load distribution on a pedestrian bridge in Hartford that had developed hairline fractures the original contractor had missed. She caught an error in a subcontractor's rebar calculations on a state highway overpass project that, if it had gone unnoticed, would have been catastrophic in a number of years. She did not let herself think too specifically about which years or how many people might have been on that overpass. She mentored 11 junior engineers, 6 of whom were still at the firm when she left, and 2 of whom had gone on to start their own practices. She brought in 3 major contracts through referrals from clients who requested her specifically. She served on 2 industry review panels, both times as the only woman in the room, both times without remarking on this because she had made a decision early in her career that she would not spend her energy remarking on it. She was not perfect. She was sometimes difficult to work with in the way that precise people are difficult to work with. She had a low tolerance for work that was approximately right when it could be exactly right, and she said so in ways that were not always gentle. Two colleagues over the years had found her intimidating. One had complained to HR, and the complaint had been reviewed and found to describe a workplace standard that was, in fact, applied to everyone equally. This was true. Miriam applied the same standard to herself that she applied to everyone else, which meant she was also sometimes difficult to be. But that was her own matter. She had a daughter, Adwoa, who was 9 years old by the time the Wednesday meeting happened. Adwoa had her mother's seriousness and her father's laugh. A big, sudden laugh that surprised people because it came out of an otherwise contained face. Miriam and Adwoa's father, David, had separated 3 years earlier, amicably enough, which is to say with the particular sadness of two people who liked each other very much and had discovered they could not build a life together from liking. He lived across the city. Adwoa spent weekends with him. The arrangement worked because both of them had decided it would work, and they were both people who honored their decisions. Miriam's apartment was organized in a way that reflected her mind. Clear surfaces, specific places for specific things, nothing decorative that did not also serve a function. Adwoa's room was the exception. It was a magnificent chaos of drawings and craft projects, and library books, and stuffed animals, arranged in hierarchies that only Adwoa understood. And Miriam had made a deliberate choice not to impose her own system on it. The room was Adwoa's space. The chaos was Adwoa's chaos. You do not redesign something that is working correctly just because it does not match your aesthetic. She drove Adwoa to school on Wednesday mornings. That particular Wednesday, Adwoa had told her about a project she was doing on the water cycle. She explained it in the careful, slightly over-formal way she had when she was very interested in something. How water evaporated and became cloud and came back as rain, and the whole thing was a circle that never really ended. It just changed shape. It is not lost, Adwoa said with some emphasis. It just goes somewhere else and comes back different. Miriam had agreed that this was correct. She dropped Adwoa at school, kissed her once on the top of her head, and drove to the office for what she had been told was a realignment conversation. She had known something was coming for approximately 6 weeks. This was not intuition. Miriam did not trade in intuition, or told herself she did not. Though the line between trained pattern recognition and intuition is thinner than engineers generally admit. What she had was evidence. The firm had brought in a consulting group in January, the kind that arrives in good suits and asks everyone process questions while writing things in notebooks. They had met with senior staff individually. Miriam's meeting had been 40 minutes and had focused heavily on which parts of her work could theoretically be systematized or redistributed. She had answered honestly, as she did everything, and had noted afterward that the questions had a particular shape. They were questions designed to find out how much of a person could be removed without visible damage. She had also noticed that the two partners closest to Duke had stopped including her in certain early-stage conversations. Not obviously, the kind of exclusion that is designed to be deniable. You simply stop being in the room for things, and if you mention it, someone says, "Oh, we were just having an informal chat," and you cannot prove otherwise. She had not mentioned it. She had, instead, quietly made sure that every project document she owned was thoroughly organized, attributed, and stored in ways that were both accessible to the firm and traceable to her specifically, not out of pettiness, out of the same instinct that made her father press his palm against the wood before cutting, understanding what you were working with before the pressure came. She had also, beginning in February, been taking one phone call a week with a headhunter named Patricia, who specialized in placing senior engineers in public infrastructure roles. Just conversations. Exploratory. She had not committed to anything. She was simply gathering information, keeping her options calibrated. She arrived at the Wednesday meeting with her portfolio documents because she never attended ambiguous meetings without evidence. This was a professional habit that some people read as aggression and others read as preparation, and she had decided years ago that the people who read it as aggression were generally not the people whose opinion she needed to manage. The conference room on the third floor was glass-walled on two sides, overlooking the open-plan workspace. There were 6 stackable chairs around a table. Duke was already there when she arrived, which meant he had wanted to establish the position of host, of person already present when you arrive, which was a negotiating move so standard she clocked it without reacting. She set her documents on the table and sat down. Duke was not a monster. This is important to say, because stories about men who do things like this are often improved in the telling, smoothed into clear-cut villainy, and the truth is rarely that clean. He was 54, trim, the kind of attractive that came from good tailoring and regular exercise, and the confidence of someone who had never had to think too hard about money. He had taken the company his father built and grown it, which was a real achievement and not nothing. He had a daughter of his own, in college, studying environmental science, which he mentioned sometimes in a way that suggested he was proud of it. He donated to a scholarship fund for first-generation engineering students, which Miriam knew because she had once reviewed the firm's charitable giving reports. He was also, in specific ways that mattered, someone who had never fully understood that the world operated according to principles he could not personally renegotiate. He started talking, and she listened. He talked about the board. He talked about the economic environment. He talked about efficiency. He used the word restructuring 4 times in the first 5 minutes, which she counted not because she was distracted, but because counting things was a habit that gave her hands something to do when her face was working to remain still. He talked about senior compensation. He looked at the table while he did this, not at her, which she noted. He talked about the consulting group's recommendations. He said they had identified some opportunities to, and here he paused, as people do when they are selecting a word carefully, which usually means the accurate word is too uncomfortable and they are looking for a softer one. Redistribute certain functions. She understood, by this point, what the meeting was. He was going to offer her a reduced role, or an adjusted title, or a lateral move that was, in practical terms, a demotion dressed in different language. He was going to wrap it in the vocabulary of organizational health and present it as something being done to the company rather than to her. She waited. He said it. The truth is, Miriam, in a company this size, everyone is replaceable. The room was quiet for a moment. Through the glass wall, she could see 3 of her colleagues at their desks. One of them looked up, briefly. She did not register his expression. She looked at Duke, and he looked back at her, with the particular expression of someone who has finished saying the difficult thing and is now waiting for the other person to absorb it and begin negotiating from a position of reduced confidence. She felt, very precisely in that moment, the shape of what was being offered. It was not being offered as a statement of fact. He did not actually believe she was replaceable in any simple operational sense. He was smarter than that. What he was offering was a frame, a reality he was inviting her to accept so that the subsequent conversation, the negotiation about her reduced role, her adjusted compensation, her quieter position in a reorganized structure, could happen on his terms. He was asking her to hold the door open from the inside. She did the math. She had been doing the math for approximately 6 weeks, but she did it again now, in the time it took to draw one breath, and the math was the same as it had been. She said, "Then replace me. No volume, no heat in it, particularly." Not the words of someone who had lost their composure, the words of someone who had found, at the bottom of a calculation, a clean answer. She stood up. She gathered her portfolio documents, every one of them, pulling them together with the same unhurried efficiency she brought to everything, and she tucked them under her arm. "I'll have my letter to HR by end of day." Duke said something. She registered his voice without registering the words, which is a thing that happens when a person has already moved past a moment, while the other person is still in it. She walked to the door. She opened it. She walked through it. She did not look back at the glass wall, at the colleagues who were watching. She was not performing anything. There was nothing in her posture that was designed for an audience. She was simply walking at the speed and in the direction she had decided to walk, which happened to be away. She sat in her car in the parking garage for 11 minutes. She knew it was 11 minutes because she watched the clock on the dashboard, which was something she did when she was thinking through something difficult. Fix on a simple, countable thing and let the rest of her mind work. She was not crying. She was not trembling. She was doing, in precise and thorough form, the kind of accounting that people usually put off, because putting it off is more comfortable than doing it. She thought about Adwoa's school fees. She thought about her mortgage. She thought about the 3 months of expenses she kept in a savings account for exactly this kind of moment, because she had always known, the way you know things when you have grown up in circumstances that do not forgive carelessness, that a moment like this might come, and you needed to have prepared for it before it arrived. She thought about Patricia the headhunter, and the conversations they had been having for 8 weeks, and the specific role that Patricia had mentioned 2 weeks ago at a municipal infrastructure authority that Miriam had not said yes to, but had also not said no to. She thought about 14 years, not with bitterness, or not only with bitterness, with the particular sobriety of someone adding up what a thing actually cost. 14 years of arriving early. 14 years of work that was right when it could simply have been adequate. 14 years of being in rooms as the only woman, often the only black woman, and doing the thing where you are excellent enough that your presence cannot be questioned, which is an exhausting way to exist, but sometimes the only way available. She thought about the bridge in Hartford with the hairline fractures. She thought about the overpass with the rebar error. She thought about the 11 engineers she had taught. She thought about her father pressing his palm against the wood. After 11 minutes, she called Patricia. "I'm ready," she said. Patricia, who had been in this business for 22 years and had heard many versions of this phone call, said simply, "Tell me what happened." Miriam told her. She wrote the resignation letter at her desk, which some people thought was bold and others thought was strange, but which was simply the logical place to write it, because her computer was there, and her reference materials were there, and she saw no reason to go home to do something she could do here. She wrote it in 30 minutes, and it was 4 paragraphs long, and completely professional. No recrimination, no catalogue of grievances. A clear statement of her last date of employment. A note that she would complete all current project documentation to full standard before she left. She submitted it at 4:47 in the afternoon. The subject line read, "Per our conversation." She cleared her desk of the things that were hers. A photograph of Adwoa, a small stone from a beach in Cape Coast that she kept because she liked the weight of it. A coffee mug that had been a gift from one of the junior engineers she had mentored. Everything else was already where it needed to be. Her project files were organized. Her notes were in the shared drive. She had been, in this way, prepared without knowing she was preparing. She said goodbye to 2 people. Celestine, who managed the office and who had brought Miriam coffee on the morning of a particularly difficult client meeting 4 years ago without being asked, and James, one of her junior engineers, who shook her hand and held it slightly longer than was standard, which was his way of saying something he had not found the words for. She drove home. She cooked dinner. A simple thing, rice and stew, the way her mother had taught her, which she made when she needed to do something with her hands that was familiar. The smell of the tomatoes and the peppers filled the apartment in a way that felt, she thought, like an argument for continuity. The world smells the same after the large things as it did before. She picked up Adwoa from the after-school program and did not say anything about what had happened, because Adwoa was 9, and what had happened was not 9-year-old material. Adwoa told her more about the water cycle project. She was going to make a diagram. "Can we get blue poster board?" Adwoa asked. "Yes," Miriam said. "And that glitter glue? The kind with the big pieces? We will see about the glitter glue." Adwoa negotiated for the glitter glue through dinner and into bath time and achieved a conditional approval, which she accepted as a full victory, which was correct, because Miriam's conditional approvals had an approximately 90% conversion rate. She kissed Adwoa goodnight and sat on the edge of her bed until her daughter's breathing settled into sleep, and then she went to the kitchen and made tea and sat at the table and allowed herself, for the first time, to be uncertain. Not afraid. Uncertainty and fear are not the same thing, though they share a texture. She was uncertain about the timeline, about how the next 3 months would feel, about whether the role Patricia had mentioned would work out, and if not that one, what the next one would be. 14 years is a long time, and leaving is a kind of removal. You pull out something load-bearing, and the structure has to redistribute. But she had watched her father work with wood for long enough to know that redistribution is not destruction. It is adjustment. It is finding the new equilibrium. She finished her tea and went to bed. 3 days later, she went back to the office to complete her documentation handover. The firm had responded to her resignation with a counteroffer, a meeting request from Duke's office, flagged as urgent, which she declined politely. There was nothing to discuss, not because she was rigid, but because she understood the shape of things, and the counteroffer was not actually about her value. It was about the inconvenience of her absence, which is a different thing, and she had been confused between the two for long enough. She spent 4 days doing the handover. She did it with the same thoroughness she brought to everything, which some of her departing employee peers would have found unnecessary. Most people, leaving a job under difficult circumstances, do not put in the extra effort. Miriam put in the extra effort because the work was real, independent of how she felt about the organization. The bridges were real. The projects were real. The junior engineers who would have to navigate the documentation after she was gone were real. She was not doing it for Duke. She was doing it because it was the right way to complete a thing. On her last day, the junior engineers threw her a small gathering in the break room. Cake from the good bakery 2 blocks away, sparkling water, a card that everyone had signed. James had written something in the card that she read twice, and then did not read again, because it threatened to destabilize the composure she had been maintaining, which she needed to maintain for 2 more hours. She left at 5 o'clock. In the elevator going down, she was alone, and she pressed her palm flat against the elevator wall. Cold, smooth, painted steel, and she held it there for a moment, the way her father had done with the wood. She was not certain what she was looking for. She was not certain she found it, but the gesture was its own thing, a private one, a way of touching the surface of something before you leave it. The doors opened. She walked out. Patricia worked quickly. By the end of the first week, there were 3 conversations scheduled with 3 different organizations. Miriam took them from her home office, the small room off the kitchen that she had converted when Adwo was born, originally intended for a crib and then repurposed when Adwo outgrew it. It was just big enough for a desk and a bookshelf. The bookshelf had her engineering texts, 2 volumes of West African history, and Adwoa's abandoned experiments with chapter books, which had stalled at the third Harry Potter and remained there. The conversations went well. She was good at interviews in the way she was good at most things, not performatively, not with the kind of enthusiasm that announces itself, but with a quiet precision that people who were paying attention could feel. She answered questions directly. She asked questions that revealed she had done her research. She did not oversell, and she did not undersell, and she was the same person at the end of the conversation that she had been at the beginning, which sounds simple, but is actually relatively rare. The role at the Northeastern Municipal Infrastructure Authority was the one she wanted. She had known this from the first conversation with Patricia. It was a Director of Structural Programs position, overseeing the assessment and rehabilitation of aging public infrastructure across 4 counties: roads, bridges, drainage systems, public buildings. Real work. Work that accumulated towards something legible. The pay was less than she had made at Dunmore, meaningfully less, about 22% less, which she had calculated before the first conversation, and continued calculating at regular intervals because she believed in looking directly at the numbers rather than softening them in her mind. 22% was significant. It required adjustments. She made the adjustments. She reviewed her budget with the same methodical attention she brought to everything else. She identified what was necessary and what was preference. She was not performing austerity. She had grown up in circumstances that had taught her the real version of it, and she knew the difference between the kind of belt-tightening that is uncomfortable and the kind that is actually hard. This was the former. She could manage the former. She had managed harder things. She accepted the role in late March, 6 weeks after her resignation. She started in May. The morning she drove to her new office for the first time, she stopped at the bridge on Route 9 that spanned the Millbrook River. She stopped because she had read about it in the authority's infrastructure assessment reports. A 1967 construction, concrete and steel, flagged for monitoring, the most recent inspection having noted some concerns about the expansion joints and what appeared to be early-stage concrete carbonation on the southern support columns. The report had been thorough, but the recommended action had been continued monitoring, which was sometimes the right call and sometimes the bureaucratic way of postponing a decision. She pulled onto the shoulder and got out of her car and stood at the railing and looked at it. It was a morning in May, cool and clear, the river running at medium height from the recent spring rains. Trucks passed behind her. She gripped the railing, solid, the metal cold under her palms, and looked down at the southern supports. She could see, from this angle, the discoloration on the concrete that the inspection report had photographed. She could not assess it from here. She would need to see the full inspection data, the original construction drawings, a hands-on survey. But she could see the shape of the problem, the way you can sometimes feel the shape of a thing before you can name it. "I see you," she said, quietly, to the bridge. It was a thing she had started doing early in her career, when she was still embarrassed about it, talking to structures. She was not embarrassed about it anymore. It was simply her way of beginning to understand something. You had to address it first. You had to acknowledge that it was there, that it had a history, that it had been carrying weight for decades and had something to show for that. She went back to her car. She drove to the office. The Northeastern Municipal Infrastructure Authority occupied the 4th floor of a government building that smelled, universally, like government buildings. a specific combination of institutional carpet and recycled air, and the particular staleness of spaces that have been used for administrative purposes for several decades. The office itself was divided into departments by half-height partitions, the kind that created the illusion of privacy while transmitting every conversation. Her office was a room with a door, which was a meaningful distinction at her level, and a window that faced east, which meant good morning light. She had brought the photograph of an Adwa, and the stone from Cape Coast, and the coffee mug, and she arranged them on the desk in the same positions they had occupied at Dunmore, because some consistencies are worth maintaining. Her staff was 11 people. She met with them individually in her first 2 weeks. 30-minute conversations, no agenda, just listening. She asked each of them about the work they were most proud of, and the work they found most frustrating, and she listened to both with equal attention. The work they were most proud of, uniformly, involved real outcomes: the rehabilitation of a particular road, the replacement of a particular culvert that had been causing flooding for years. The work they found most frustrating, uniformly, involved the gap between knowing something needed to be done and having the institutional capacity to do it. The authority was perpetually underfunded. Decision-making was slow. Projects that needed to move in months moved in years. Good engineers were watching infrastructure deteriorate at a pace that outran the budget to address it. She heard this and nodded, and did not make promises she could not keep. She had learned, over 14 years, that premature promises are a form of dishonesty, even when they come from a good place. What she said, to each of them, was this: "Tell me what we actually need. Not what you think is possible. What we actually need." This was a different question from the ones they were used to being asked, and it produced different answers, more honest ones. Bigger ones, in some cases uncomfortably big, because people had learned to pre-constrain their own answers to the size of the budget they expected to be given. She wrote everything down. She began building the case. The Route 9 bridge was her first major project. The hands-on assessment confirmed what she had seen from the railing: early-stage carbonation on the southern supports, some concern about the expansion joints, and an additional issue with the drainage that hadn't been fully captured in the inspection report. Not an emergency. Not yet. But the window for addressing it at moderate cost rather than extreme cost was a defined one, and it was closing. She wrote a project brief that was 28 pages long. This was considered, by the standards of the office, extremely detailed. Her predecessor's briefs had averaged 9 pages. She was aware of this comparison and found it irrelevant. The bridge required 28 pages of careful argument, so she wrote 28 pages. She presented it to the authority board in September. There were 9 board members, 7 of whom had no engineering background, and she had prepared for this by thinking carefully about how to explain structural reality to people whose frame of reference was political and budgetary rather than technical. She did not talk down to them. She also did not hide the technical complexity behind reassuring vagueness. She had learned that the worst thing you can do with a serious problem is make it sound manageable when it isn't, because then the decision-makers do not allocate the appropriate resources and the manageable problem becomes an emergency, and at that point the cost, financial, human, structural, is always much higher. She showed them the photographs. She showed them the progression model. What the carbonation would look like in 3 years, in 5 years, in 10 if not addressed. She showed them the comparative cost analysis between intervention now and intervention later. She made the numbers clear and did not round them in ways that obscured their meaning. One board member, a man named Aldous, who had served on the authority for 11 years, and prided himself on a certain skepticism that he called fiscal prudence, and others called obstructionism, asked whether the assessment was perhaps being somewhat alarmist. Miriam looked at him. In 2019, she said, a highway bridge in Genoa, Italy collapsed. It had been showing signs of structural concern for years. 43 people died. The subsequent analysis found that the repairs, if they had been made when the concerns were first identified, would have cost approximately $100 million. The emergency response, the rebuilding, the legal costs, and the economic disruption cost approximately $6 billion. I am not saying Route 9 is in that situation. I am saying that the language of being alarmist versus being prudent takes on a different meaning when you look at those numbers. The room was quiet. The board approved the project. ADWOA came to the site on a Saturday in November, when the initial survey work was underway, and Miriam had arranged for a safety walk for her small team and a few family members. ADWOA wore a hard hat that was slightly too large and kept sliding forward over her eyes. She pushed it back every few minutes with the back of her hand, a gesture that was so automatic and so absorbed that Miriam found herself watching it with a warmth that she did not have a specific word for. They stood on the survey platform on the southern side and looked at the support columns up close. "Why is it that color?" ADWOA asked. The discolored concrete, up close, had a grayish-white chalky quality in patches. When concrete is made, it has something called calcium hydroxide inside it, Miriam said. Over time, if water and carbon dioxide can get in, the calcium hydroxide changes into something else, calcium carbonate. And as it does, it changes the way the concrete behaves. ADWOA considered this. "It's like the concrete is getting old," she said. "In a way, yes, and you have to help it. We have to understand what it needs and address that." "Yes." ADWOA looked at the column for a moment longer, then looked up at the bridge above them, the underside of the deck, the steel girders, the expanse of it carrying 2 lanes of traffic in each direction. "It's very big," she said. "It is, and it carries all that weight." "It does, every day." ADWOA seemed to weigh this. "I'm glad you're fixing it," she said, as if this was a simple and complete statement, which it was. Miriam put her hand on the top of ADWOA's hard hat and held it there for a moment, keeping it in place. She had been at the authority for 8 months when she heard, through the particular osmosis by which professional information travels, that Dunmore Infrastructure Group was having a difficult season. She heard it from James, the junior engineer who had shaken her hand too long on her last day, and whom she had stayed in contact with in the low-maintenance way of 2 people who respected each other and occasionally needed to send an article or a professional reference. He texted her one morning, "Thought you might have seen this," with a link to an industry newsletter article about the firm. She read it once. The article was careful in the way that industry journalism is careful. No direct accusations, nothing that could cause legal trouble. But the substance was there. The Northeast portfolio had underperformed significantly in the 2 quarters since her departure. 2 major contracts had experienced delays substantial enough to trigger penalty clauses. A third-party structural review had been required on one project, the cost of which the article did not specify, but which had been described by a source as significant. The firm had hired 3 people in the period to replace functions that had previously been handled by a single senior position, and there had already been 1 departure among the 3. She put her phone down and looked at her window for a moment. She did not feel vindicated, exactly. Vindication was for situations where the outcome was in doubt, and she had never seriously doubted this outcome. What she felt was something closer to a quiet sadness, the particular sadness that comes from watching something fail that could have been avoided. The work she had done at Dunmore had been real. The structures she had helped build and assess and protect were still standing, still carrying weight, still real. The fact that the organization had made choices that led to this result did not change what the work had been. She texted James back. "I saw it. How are you doing?" He wrote back, "Learning a lot," which was his way of saying it was difficult. She understood. "You know where I am if you need a reference or a conversation," she wrote. He wrote, "I know. Thank you." She went back to work. Winter in the four-county region was hard on infrastructure. It was always hard on infrastructure. The freeze-thaw cycle is one of the most powerful destructive forces in the built environment. The way water expands when it freezes and contracts when it thaws, creating pressures inside the material that, repeated hundreds of times over the course of a winter, will eventually find the weakness in anything. She drove her region regularly. She had developed the habit, early in her time at the authority, of driving the major routes herself, on her way to and from work, varying her paths, so that over the course of a week she had covered most of the primary infrastructure. She carried a notebook in the passenger seat and dictated observations to her phone if she saw something that needed logging. It was on one of these drives, in January, that she saw the issue with the culvert on County Road 7. She had been driving it twice a week for months, and had always noted the water pooling near the shoulder on the eastern side, had noted it and assessed it as moderate concern, drainage issue, needed attention, but not immediate. That morning, after a night of freezing temperatures following a day of rain, she saw that the pooling had changed. The edge of the road surface had a quality that she could not articulate in technical terms from a moving vehicle, but that registered clearly as wrong. She pulled over. She got out. She walked the shoulder. The edge of the pavement had what appeared to be a subsidence, a slight downward shift, almost imperceptible, but present, and the shoulder itself had a texture underfoot that was not correct, a very slight give, a not quite solidness, that told her something had happened to the drainage structure beneath. She called her deputy, a man named Frank who had 15 years of field experience and a manner so unflappable that she had come to think of him as structurally stable in his own right. "County Road 7, Eastern Shoulder, near the mile marker 12 culvert," she said. "I need a full inspection team out today. I need the road flagged for a weight limit reduction as soon as you can arrange it." "How bad?" Frank said. "I don't know yet. That's why I need the team." The team found that the culvert, a 60-year-old corrugated steel pipe, had failed. Not completely, not yet, but the failure was advanced enough that the soil above and around it had begun to migrate, leaving a void beneath the road surface that was not visible from above. The road was, in effect, over a hollow space. Had a loaded truck taken that shoulder, or had the subsidence progressed through a few more freeze-thaw cycles without being caught, the surface could have collapsed. The road was closed. The culvert was replaced over 4 days. The shoulder was rebuilt. She wrote up the incident report with the same thoroughness she applied to everything. In the section for summary notes, she wrote, "Early identification of this failure prevented potential road surface collapse. Regular monitoring of drainage infrastructure, specifically aging culverts, is a high-value activity that should be systematized and adequately resourced." The report went to the board. The board allocated funding for a systematic culvert assessment program across all 4 counties. Frank told her, afterward, in the particular understated way he communicated things, that she had probably prevented something that would have been very bad. "That's the job," she said. "Yes," he said, "but it helps to do it well." The Route 9 rehabilitation project moved through its stages over the following year. It moved more slowly than she would have liked, because these things always do. Procurement takes the time it takes, and weather windows close, and there are always complications that the original schedule did not accommodate because the original schedule was made by people who wanted the project to sound manageable. But it moved, steadily, in the right direction, with the work done correctly at each stage, and by the spring of her second year at the authority, the southern support columns had been treated, the expansion joints had been replaced, and the drainage had been redesigned. She was on site for the final inspection. She walked the underside of the bridge with the project engineer and her deputy Frank and the contractor's site supervisor, going through the checklist with the methodical patience of someone who does not accept approximately finished when exactly finished is available. When they were done, when everything was signed off, she stood for a moment on the riverbank and looked at the bridge. It looked the same as it had the day she had pulled over on the shoulder in May, 14 months ago. It was not obviously different. There was no aesthetic change, no marker that said this was fixed here. The concrete looked like concrete. The steel looked like steel. But she knew what was different. She knew what was underneath the surface now, what had been addressed and what had been stabilized. The bridge knew, in the way that structures know things, in load and stress and the distribution of weight over time. Still there, she said quietly. She did not say it to anyone. It was its own thing, private. She went back to her car. Adwoa finished her water cycle project and received, from her teacher, a response that was enthusiastic enough to be memorable. The poster board had been blue, and the glitter glue, the big piece kind, had been deployed with a freedom of spirit that Miriam found both visually overwhelming and entirely correct. The project explained evaporation and condensation and precipitation and the way the water moved through the cycle continuously, changing form, but not disappearing. "It is not lost," Adwoa had written on the poster, apparently quoting herself from the car conversation several months earlier. "It just goes somewhere else and comes back different." Miriam had the poster framed. It hung in her home office, next to the bookshelf with the engineering texts and the abandoned Harry Potter. It was, she thought, a reasonable description of many things. She met Duke again, approximately 18 months after she left Dunmore. It was at an industry event, an annual infrastructure conference held at a hotel in the city. She had been asked to speak on a panel about public-private partnerships in infrastructure rehabilitation. He was there as a firm representative, attending a different panel. She saw him across the hotel lobby, and he saw her. There are many ways a moment like this can go, and most of them are bad, awkward, charged, scripted toward a resolution that neither party actually wants to have. She had not prepared for this moment because preparation implies anticipation, and she had not anticipated it. She nodded. He walked over. He was in a good suit. He looked, if anything, slightly more tired than she remembered. The particular tiredness of a year that had not gone the way it was supposed to. "Miriam," he said. "Charles," she said, which was the name he had been given and not the name he preferred, but which was accurate. He asked how she was. She told him she was well, which was true. He asked about the authority. She said it was good work. He nodded. He said he had heard good things, and she did not ask what he had heard or from whom, because it was not a conversation she wanted to extend into those territories. He said, "I wanted to say I may have handled things poorly." She looked at him. He was not apologizing exactly, he was doing something adjacent to it. The kind of statement that contains the shape of acknowledgement without committing to the full substance of it. She recognized this. She had heard it before, in other contexts, from other people. She thought about what she wanted to say in response, and found that the answer was, "Not very much." "We made different decisions," she said. Mine worked out well for me. I hope yours are working out for the firm. This was not magnanimity. It was accuracy. She genuinely did not know whether she wished him specifically well or ill, and she had decided some months ago that this ambiguity was fine, that she did not need to resolve it into a cleaner feeling. He said goodbye. She said goodbye. She went to her panel. She sat at the long table with 4 other engineers, 2 from public agencies, 2 from private firms. And she talked for 50 minutes about the practical realities of how you address aging infrastructure when the funding is always less than the need and the timeline is always shorter than the problem. She was clear. She was specific. She did not use vague language to sound more confident than the evidence supported. When she did not know something, she said she did not know it, and said what she would need in order to know it. Afterward, 3 people came up to ask her specific questions. 2 of them gave her their cards. One of them was a deputy secretary at the State Transportation Department, who mentioned that they were beginning to think about a larger infrastructure assessment initiative and were looking for people who could speak to what actually worked in the field. She took the card. She wrote on the back of it, in her own handwriting, the 3 specific things she would want to talk to them about if they called. She drove home. She picked up Adwoa from David's apartment, where Adwoa had spent the weekend. Adwoa was in a phase of deep interest in geology, rocks, specifically, their formation and classification, and she explained on the car ride home the difference between igneous and sedimentary and metamorphic, with a thoroughness that left very little room for questions. Miriam listened. She asked one question. At the end, which kind is the strongest? Adwoa considered this seriously. It depends, she said, on what you mean by strong. Metamorphic rock is formed under the most pressure, so in some ways, it is the most changed and the most compressed. But that doesn't mean it's the best for everything. It depends on what you need it to do. Miriam looked at the road ahead. That's right, she said. It always depends on what you need it to do. The State Transportation Department called. She took the meeting. The meeting became a working group. The working group produced a report. The report, which she co-authored with a team of 7 other infrastructure professionals over the course of 4 months, outlined a systematic approach to assessing and prioritizing rehabilitation work on aging public infrastructure across the state. A framework that could guide funding decisions and inspection schedules and project sequencing in a way that was evidence-based rather than reactive. It was, she thought, the most useful thing she had written in her professional life. Not the most technical, not the most elaborate, the most useful, the document most likely to result in things being found and addressed before they became catastrophic, in the particular unglamorous ongoing way that good infrastructure management works. She presented it to the State Transportation Board in the spring of her 3rd year at the authority. She did not perform excitement about it. She explained it. She answered questions. She corrected misunderstandings with patience and without condescension. When one board member suggested that the framework was perhaps more thorough than strictly necessary, she explained, as she had explained to the authority board 3 years earlier, why thorough and necessary were often the same thing when the subject was structures carrying the weight of daily life. The framework was adopted. She drove home that evening on Route 9, as she sometimes did when she wanted to pass the bridge. She did not stop. She drove across it at normal speed. 2 lanes, traffic moving, the river below, the steel and the treated concrete, and the replaced expansion joints, all doing exactly what they were supposed to do, which is to say holding, quietly, bearing the weight, the way good structures do. She pressed her palm briefly against the steering wheel as she crossed, which was not the same as touching the bridge, but was its own gesture, a small private one. Her phone buzzed on the passenger seat. She did not look at it until she was stopped at the light on the far side. It was James. He had sent a photograph. Him, in a hard hat, on what appeared to be a site somewhere, grinning in the particular way of someone who had just done something they were proud of. Director of Structural Programs, he had written. Started today. She looked at the photograph. She felt something that she did not immediately name, and then named it. The specific warmth of watching someone arrive at a place they had earned. She wrote back, "You're exactly where you're supposed to be." He sent back a single word, "Finally." She put her phone in her bag and drove the rest of the way home. It was Adwoa who asked her, eventually, about Dunmore. She was 12 by then, old enough to ask real questions and to sit with real answers. They were in the kitchen on a Sunday morning, Miriam making coffee, and Adwoa at the table with a notebook, working on something for school. And she looked up suddenly, in the way she sometimes did, arriving at a question from some direction that wasn't visible, and said, "Mom, why did you leave your old job?" Miriam poured her coffee. She thought about how to answer this in a way that was honest and age-appropriate, and not a simplification that would require correction later. "The person who ran the company said something to me that wasn't true," she said. "He said I was replaceable." Adwoa considered this. "Were you?" Everyone is replaceable in some technical sense. You can always find someone to sit in a chair, but replacing the specific work that someone does, the knowledge they have, the things they've built, the way they understand a problem, that's harder. He said it to try to make me feel less certain about my value, so that I would accept less than I had earned. And you didn't. I didn't. Adwoa turned her pencil over and tapped the eraser on the table, a thinking gesture she had had since she was small. Why do people do that? Try to make you feel less. Miriam sat down across from her with her coffee. Because if you feel less, you ask for less. It's very simple. It's one of the oldest ways that power works. Convincing people that they are smaller than they are, so that they stay in smaller spaces. But you knew you weren't smaller. I knew. It took me a long time to know it as well as I know it now. But I knew it enough. Adwoa looked at her for a moment. "I think," she said, in the careful, slightly over-formal way she had when she was working out something she found important, "that is a good reason to understand things very well, so that other people cannot tell you they are different from what they are." Miriam looked at her daughter, 12 years old, serious, working something out with the focused attention that was entirely her own, and somehow also entirely familiar. "Yes," she said. "That's exactly right." Adwoa went back to her notebook. Miriam drank her coffee. Outside, a Sunday morning in spring was proceeding in its ordinary way. Birds, traffic at a distance, the low sound of the city going about its business. Inside, the kitchen was warm and clear and organized in the way that Miriam organized things. Every object in its correct place, the whole system functioning as it was supposed to. She thought about the bridge. She thought about her father's hands on the wood, flat and still, reading what was inside. She thought about Adwoa's water cycle poster on the wall in the next room. It is not lost. It just goes somewhere else and comes back different. She thought about the 14 years, and the Wednesday meeting, and the 3 words that had ended one thing and begun another, and the particular quality of that moment in the parking garage when she had watched the clock and done the accounting and decided what came next. She thought about the Route 9 bridge, standing on its treated columns over the Millbrook River, carrying its weight every day, in the ordinary, unobserved way of structures that are working correctly. She thought about James in his hard hat, grinning on a site somewhere, having arrived exactly where he was supposed to be. She thought about how sometimes the most important thing a structure can do is hold, quietly, without announcement, bearing what it is given, day after day, until the weight is simply ordinary and the holding is simply who you are. The coffee was warm in her hands. Outside, the morning continued. She was, in this moment and in the larger sense, exactly where she was supposed to be. And the work, real, careful, ongoing, was waiting.